Greetings. Welcome to Dr. English's Book Lovers Book Club. I'm Dr. English and I teach English. This week I'm continuing on my saga of rereading some of the dystopian literature from, this was actually from 1932, so it was written before World War II. There is at the end, they include the foreword to his 1946 edition, where Huxley, talked about things he didn't quite get right, and if he could rewrite the book, he would do differently. But he said, of course, he's not going to rewrite the book because he wrote it at a certain time in a certain place with the best knowledge he had. And so I find that fascinating. That I always read, I know that there's a foreword too by a professor, and I really enjoyed that too. It was the introduction, and it really gave us an idea, like the things that he thought Huxley was not happy with. He was criticizing, Henry Ford, and John Sutherland is his name. And I really enjoy reading those kinds of things because I just find it really fascinating that a scholar from 2013, looking at it in 2013, says Huxley versus Henry Ford, Huxley versus D.H. Lawrence, and Huxley versus the Jazz Age, which I found is kind of nice to read that and then reread it, and look for those things that he, upset Aldous Huxley. There's also a wonderful timeline and chronology of Brave New World and Huxley's life and what was going on in the world. I think that was really helpful, especially if you're reading it in, as he was reading it in 2013. And I can say, when I read this like 30 some years ago, I was a student in a class called 20th Century Issues. And it was really a study of all dystopian. We read Brave New World, we read 1984, we read On the Beach, we read Homage to Catalonia, we read The Holocaust by Nora Levine, we read Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. So that would have been about 1987 or 88, and it was good for me then, to be far removed from the World War II and the atrocities of the totalitarian government of Adolf Hitler, but also as post, World War II, where in the Soviet Union, you had Stalin, doing very similar things of murdering people, disappearing people. And so, but I can recall back from in 1987 or 88 that I came out of that class thinking this was the one I thought was like really did a really good job of kind of predicting some things, because I think now we do have that kind of genetic engineering. Maybe not necessarily humans, but people do, can, genetically engineer embryos. We know that. We have Dolly, and we've had genetically engineered sheep. We have genetically engineered plants. I live in Nebraska. We have genetically modified corn and soybeans. So that part of it, I think he got right. But not necessarily decanting babies out of jars. But I think I was just fascinated by that when I read that, and I just thought that just the whole concept of really dehumanizing humans to me is really all about. And also, I think the thing that really appealed to me about Brave New World was it's a tragedy. I mean, he really took it on as a Shakespearean, because he's got the Shakespeare in it, if John's the Savage John. And it really appealed to me that he was writing it from a perspective of, why do we feel like this is such a brave new world? And so to me, the whole book is really written as a tragedy in the best sense of Shakespeare, even though it's a novel about totalitarianism and what happens when a particular group of people, and it's always the other fascinating thing in both 1984 and Brave New World, there are still the people with all the power who are living their life much better than everybody else. And so that part of, so both books really are talking about class. There's a class war that's been going on forever since the beginning of human civilization. That hasn't changed. It's like that right now, all over the world. So the idea of class is really highlighted most in Brave New World, because you have the deltas and the dreaded epsilons are like treated worse than dogs. And they're actually bred in these decanters to be a particular thing by manipulating what happens to them in the what we would say the womb. In this book, it's like a glass jar. So those things are all like fascinating to me that instead of just showing that, people are born into a particular class, they're actually manipulating that, people would be a particular thing. And so, but there's always a group on the top and there's always a group on the bottom. In 1984, the proles are, they are treated as nothing or less than nothing. So that part of both novels really strikes me, and I think it's true. Like, having read all of the Hunger Game again, same thing. They all have come up with very similar ideas about classism and how that kind of class hierarchy affects people, and there's always going to be people on the top. And I find that that people need to be reminded of that we are a very class conscious society in every era. So I think the thing about this the part when John Savage comes, that whole storyline to me is just fascinating. I find that so heartbreaking, and yet as a reader I'm like absolutely, um, you know I'm identifying with John. And most of us would as we were reading this, because this is how our world has been for so long. And so you really do, feel this kind of empathy to John uh, when he, becomes part of the novel. It takes a little bit of time. It's like, Huxley, you could have gotten to the point a lot quicker, but that's the building of the narrative. Um, and the other thing is, as a longtime, English professor and high school teacher, I absolutely love Shakespeare, and so I always think of John as being he's Miranda, and I know Huxley obviously, he does very, you know, um, pointed in making, making that comparison. So I'm going to read a couple of things from here, um, and the first one is with is the part with John, the savage. The young man drew a deep breath. To think it should be coming true, what I've dreamt of all my life. Do you remember what Miranda says? Who's Miranda? But the young man had evidently not heard the question. Oh, wonder, he was saying, and his eyes shone, his face was brightly flushed. How many goodly creatures are there here? How beauteous mankind is. The flush suddenly deepened. He was thinking of Lenina, of an angel in bottle green viscose, lustrous with youth and skin food. Plump, benevolently smiling, his voice faltered. "Oh, brave new world," he began, then suddenly interrupted himself. "Oh, brave new world," he began. The blood had left his cheeks. Oh, brave new world," he began, then suddenly interrupted himself. Sorry about that. The blood had left his cheeks. He was as pale as paper. "Are you married to her?" he asked. "Am I what?" "Married, forever. They say forever in the Indian words. It can't be broken." "Ford, no." Bernard couldn't help laughing. John also laughed, but for another reason. Laughed for pure joy. "Oh, brave new world," he repeated. "Oh, brave new world that has such people in it. Let's start at once." "You have a most peculiar way of talking sometimes," said Bernard, staring at the young man in perplexed astonishment. "And anyhow, hadn't you better wait till you actually see the new world?" I couldn't have more prophetic words from Bernard by asking him about that, about maybe you should wait to see the new world, because he was on a reservation in New Mexico, and we find out that his mother had been left there, and she had been pregnant, which in that society nobody's supposed to have babies. That's like the sacrilege, because everybody's to be decanted. So and so she's left there, and then she has her son John is living on this reservation with indigenous people. And then he's really falling, really hard for Fanny, Lenina. Fanny is Lenina's friend. And this passage I'm going to read this is the thing that after 30 some years, I still remember the lines of this little ditty. And it's just like whenever someone brings up Brave New World, I think of, well, of course, I always thought about the part about the relation to The Tempest by Shakespeare, but also this little ditty. And I wanted to read this because it's just, it's it's the idea of soma. I think that's the other thing about Brave New World, is that I definitely think that Huxley got that right about soma. Like people, back then, probably had access to other illicit drugs besides alcohol, But this is one that I think is probably the most like what we would consider oxycodone, or like that is the one that people just, they don't have really bad side effects to it, so, but I mean, it's like it can kill you. So if you have too much of it. So I'm like, I think it was the precursor for that actual drug. um okay, so it's wonderful, of course, and yet in a way she had confessed to Fanny, I feel as though we're getting something on false pretenses, because of course the first thing they all want to know is what it's like to make love to a savage. And I have to say, I don't know. She shook her head. Most of the men don't believe me, of course, but it's true. I wish it weren't, she added sadly, and sighed. He's terribly good looking, don't you think so? But doesn't he like you? Asked Fanny. Sometimes I think he does, and sometimes I think he doesn't. He always does his best to avoid me. Goes out of the room when I come in, won't touch me, won't even look at me. But sometime I turn around suddenly, I catch him staring, and then, well, you know how men look when they like you. Yes, Fanny knew. I can't make it out, said Lenina. She couldn't make it out, and not only was bewildered, was also rather upset. Because you see, Fanny, I like him more and more. Well, now there'd be a real chance, she thought, as she scented herself after her bath. Dab, 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 a real chance. Her high spirits overflowed in a song. Hug me till you drug me, honey. Kiss me till I'm in a coma. Hug me, honey, snugly bunny. Love's as good as Soma. And for some weird reason, after all these years, that is something I still remember. Hug me till you drug me, honey. Kiss me till I'm in a coma. And I just thought, what a funny little ditty that comes out of this book. I always like to think, where did he come up with that? But I think it's definitely tells us a lot about like how people, like anesthetize themselves. And we find people doing that a lot in our modern society in different ways. And so, should you teach this in high school? I think it is something that's been taught, but I don't think it's taught nearly as much as 1984. I think it would be really fascinating to, if I could go back and teach high school, I would definitely put this on my list of books I would like to like come, put it together with, the Hunger Games or something like that. To have a classic and a contemporary novel, this would be the one I would choose, because I feel like, the ending is it. I mean, it's like I said, it's a tragedy in the best sense of Shakespeare, but obviously it's written, as a dystopian novel. But it's also they're all, I mean, you could say they're all tragic. And I told a friend I was reading these books, and they said, "Why would you want to be that depressed?" I'm like, "No, it's not about that. It's just about revisiting some of the things that people wrote to leave as a warning about the future." And I still believe that to be true, and I think more people should read them. So, thank you for joining me this week. I know these are more heavy topics, but I still think this is probably the best written one, as far as the narrative of it. Uh, they're all important to me, so I hope that you'll take the time to read both of them. And hopefully next week I'll have a Neville Shutes on the Beach, which now that one is a little depressing, but still books I read from, that one I probably read in the 70s. So thanks for joining me. Bye.